Somewhere off the windswept coast of County Antrim, on a tiny island called Rathlin, archaeologists uncovered the remains of a Bronze Age man who had been buried nearly 4,000 years ago. When scientists finally extracted and sequenced his DNA, they expected to find the usual mix of ancient European ancestry scattered across the genome. What they actually found sent geneticists scrambling back through population databases from every corner of Europe, because his Y chromosome and the Y chromosomes of thousands of living Irish men tested since kept pointing to the exact same unlikely place over and over again, a rugged, mountainous, culturally isolated region on the other side of the continent that speaks a language related to absolutely nothing else on Earth. The Basque country. Not England, not France, not Scandinavia. A small, fiercely independent region straddling the border of modern Spain and France. Turned out to be the single closest genetic match to the people of Ireland found anywhere in Europe. And when scientists dug into why, they uncovered a chain of ancient migrations, near total population replacements, and one of the most disturbing royal burials ever excavated on Irish soil, a story so strange that it completely rewrites what most people assume about where the Irish actually came from. So if you think you already know the story of Irish ancestry, stay with me, because the DNA reveals something nobody expected. Let's start with the genetic marker at the center of this entire mystery, because understanding it is the key to understanding everything else. Deep inside the Y chromosome, the piece of DNA passed exclusively from father to son across countless generations. Geneticists track specific mutations called haplogroups, essentially genetic branch markers that let researchers trace paternal lineages back thousands of years. One particular haplogroup, known as R1b, and more specifically a subbranch called R1b1A2A or 1A2C, or M529, shows up in the Y chromosomes of Irish men at levels higher than almost anywhere else on the planet. Ireland show what researchers describe as the global maximum frequency of this exact genetic marker, meaning nowhere else in the entire world do you find this specific paternal lineage concentrated more heavily than in Ireland. And when researchers went looking for the only other population on Earth carrying comparably high frequencies of this same deep genetic signature, there was really only one serious answer: the Basque region of northern Spain and southwestern France. One detailed genetic study analyzing 17 different genetic markers across Basque and Irish male populations found that when you plot the genetic distances between different European populations on a chart, the population of Ireland does not cluster anywhere near England, France, or Scandinavia. It segregates directly inside the Basque cluster itself, sitting closest of all to the Basque province of Guipuzcoa, closer genetically to that specific corner of Spain than to almost any of the other Basque provinces studied in the same research. That is an almost unbelievable finding when you consider the geography involved, two populations separated by well over 1,000 miles of ocean and continent, one speaking Gaelic, one speaking Euskara. A language so unique, linguists still cannot connect it to any other language family on the planet, and yet their deep paternal genetic ancestry lines up more closely with each other than with almost anyone standing physically between them. So why would Ireland and the Basque country, of all places, end up so closely connected genetically? To answer that, you have to go back to one of the most dramatic population upheavals in the story of ancient Europe, the same steppe migration that transformed Scotland, Spain, and much of the rest of the continent. Around 5,000 years ago, herders originating from the vast grasslands north of the Black and Caspian Seas, a population known to geneticists as the Yamna, began a sweeping expansion across Europe, carried forward first by a related group called the Bell Beaker culture, named for the distinctive bell-shaped pottery found buried alongside their dead. This migration is now understood to be one of the largest population movements in European prehistory, and it reshaped the genetic makeup of nearly every region it touched. When these Beaker-descended populations reached the far western edges of Europe, they did not stop at the coastline. They kept going, out into the Atlantic fringe, into what is now Brittany in France, into the Basque country, and across the sea into Ireland itself, carrying with them the same paternal R1b lineages that had already begun replacing local populations across much of the continent. And in Ireland specifically, researchers found direct genetic proof of just how total this replacement actually was. In 2015, a team of geneticists sequenced ancient DNA from Bronze Age skeletons recovered on Rathlin Island, comparing them against an even older Neolithic genome recovered from a woman buried at a site called Ballinahaddy near Belfast, a farmer who lived roughly 5,200 years ago. The contrast between these two genomes, separated by only around 1,500 years, was staggering. The Neolithic farming woman from Ballinahaddy showed closest genetic affinity to populations from the southwest Mediterranean, essentially matching the same early farmer ancestry found across much of Neolithic Europe, tracing back to migrants who had originally spread from the Near East thousands of years earlier. But the Bronze Age men from Rathlin Island showed something completely different. Their genomes carried substantial ancestry connected to populations from the Caucasus region and the Pontic steppe. Genetic ancestry that researchers found was completely absent in the earlier Balanahadi genome and in other Neolithic samples studied from Western Europe. Every single one of the Bronze Age Rathlin men carried the Y chromosome lineage, R1b-M269, the same steppe-associated paternal marker linked to that massive beaker migration, sweeping across the continent. Researchers describe this as clear evidence that the great wave of genomic change, which began north of the Black Sea, had traveled an almost unbelievable distance, washing all the way to the northeastern shore of Ireland, the most westerly major island in Europe, essentially the very end of the line for this migration across the entire continent. This transition also planted the genetic seeds for something that defines Irish identity in a very literal physical sense even today. Researchers found that several genetic traits reaching their highest frequencies anywhere in Europe, specifically within the Irish population, including the gene responsible for lactase persistence, meaning the ability to digest milk into adulthood, and the genes most strongly associated with blue eye color, first appear prominently in the genetic record precisely at this Bronze Age horizon, arriving alongside these steppe-descended newcomers. Even more strikingly, researchers detected in this same Rathlin Island genome one of the very first identifiable examples of a known genetic disease mutation ever found in ancient human DNA anywhere in the world, a mutation connected to hemochromatosis, a hereditary condition that causes the body to absorb and store dangerous excess amounts of iron. This particular mutation is so heavily concentrated in modern Ireland that doctors and geneticists worldwide often refer to it simply as the Celtic disease. In Ireland, carries by far the highest documented frequency of this specific genetic mutation anywhere on Earth, a direct genetic inheritance traceable back through roughly 4,000 years of unbroken ancestry to those same Bronze Age settlers who arrived from the steppe by way of the beaker migration. Now here is where the Basque connection becomes genuinely fascinating, because the same steppe-descended wave that swept into Ireland also crashed into Iberia, but the outcome played out completely differently, depending on the region. Across most of the Iberian Peninsula, researchers found this incoming population almost entirely erased the existing local male lineages within a matter of a few centuries. But the Basque country followed a strikingly different path. Genetic research shows the Basque population absorbed a significant amount of this incoming R1b steppe ancestry, dated by researchers to somewhere between roughly 3,700 and 4,500 years ago, depending on the specific Basque province studied, remarkably close in time to when the same ancestry was arriving in Ireland. But afterward, the Basque region became something highly unusual for the rest of European history, a genetic refuge that largely escaped the later waves of migration and conquest that reshaped almost every other population on the continent. Researchers note that the Basques were barely affected genetically by the Roman Empire, by later Germanic invasions, or by the centuries of Moorish rule that transformed so much of the rest of Iberian ancestry. While the rest of Europe kept absorbing new populations, new conquerors, and new genetic input century after century, the Basque country largely stayed genetically frozen in place after that initial steppe-descended wave settled in, protected in part by its rugged, mountainous, difficult-to-conquer terrain and its fierce cultural independence. Ireland followed an almost eerily parallel path for very similar geographic reasons, an island sitting at the extreme western edge of Europe, harder to reach, harder to conquer, and comparatively more insulated from many of the later populatio and upheavals. Roman expansion never even reached Irish shores at all, that dramatically reshaped the genetic landscape of England and much of the European mainland. Two populations, thousands of miles apart, both absorbing that same ancient Bronze Age. Steppe wave, and both then remaining relatively genetically isolated for thousands of years afterward, is precisely why, even today, their Y chromosomes still echo each other more closely than either one echoes their nearer neighbors. That same 2015 study uncovered another detail that adds crucial context to this whole picture, and it directly explains a genetic pattern many people notice without ever understanding why. When researchers tested how strongly these ancient Irish genomes matched different modern populations across the British Isles, they found the Rathlin Bronze Age genome shared its highest genetic affinity specifically with modern Irish, Scottish, and Welsh populations, exactly the regions historically associated with Celtic language and culture, while modern English populations showed a noticeably weaker genetic connection to this same ancient signal. Researchers explained this discrepancy as a direct result of later Anglo-Saxon migrations into England, a substantial wave of Germanic settlers arriving from continental Europe centuries after the Bronze Age, who significantly diluted and reshaped the genetic makeup of England in ways that never happened to nearly the same degree in Ireland, Scotland, or Wales. This finding, that Bronze Age Irish DNA lines up strongly with the modern Celtic fringe of the British Isles, but noticeably weaker with modern England specifically, suggests something scientists describe as remarkable genetic continuity stretching across more than 4,000 years at what researchers call the insular Celtic edge of Europe, a population that, in genetic terms, has remained comparatively stable and rooted in the same corner of the map since the Bronze Age itself. Now, let's talk about something researchers found even further back in time. Something that reveals Ireland's genetic story did not simply begin with this Bronze Age steppe migration, but was already being reshaped by dramatic population turnover even earlier, during the Neolithic period. In 2020, a research team led by geneticist Laura Cassidy sequenced 44 ancient Irish genomes recovered from passage grave burial sites, spanning an enormous stretch of time from roughly 4700 to 2900 BC, essentially covering nearly 2,000 years of early Irish farming society. What they found revealed that Ireland had already experienced a major population replacement even before the Bronze Age beaker wave arrived. Nearly every male genome studied from these earlier Neolithic farming communities belonged to Y chromosome haplogroup I, an entirely different paternal lineage from the R1b signature that would later dominate Bronze Age in modern Ireland, with only 2 individuals in the entire data set carrying a different marker known as haplogroup H. When researchers compared this pattern against the Y chromosomes recovered from the later Bronze Age Rathlin men, every single one of whom carried R1b instead, the contrast pointed decisively toward yet another episode of substantial population replacement. An earlier Neolithic farming population, genetically connected to Mediterranean and Near Eastern ancestry, being significantly displaced by the incoming Bronze Age steppe, descended newcomers who would go on to define the genetic profile of Ireland for the next 4,000 years and counting. But the single most disturbing discovery buried inside this same 2020 study had nothing to do with population migration at all, and everything to do with what researchers found hidden inside the DNA of one specific individual, a man buried at the heart of Newgrange, one of the most spectacular and important Neolithic monuments anywhere on Earth, an enormous passage tomb constructed with such extraordinary architectural precision that its inner chamber floods with sunlight only once a year, precisely at dawn on the winter solstice. This man was clearly someone of extraordinary status, buried at the absolute ceremonial center of one of the most sophisticated engineering achievements of the entire Neolithic world. When Cassidy's research team sequenced his genome, they found something that stunned the entire archaeological community and made international headlines. His parents were first-degree relatives, not distant cousins, not a socially acceptable close marriage within a small community. His genome showed unmistakable evidence that his mother and father were either full siblings or, researchers noted, potentially even parent and child. This level of genetic relatedness, described by researchers as extraordinarily rare and essentially unprecedented at this social scale anywhere in the prehistoric archaeological record studied at that point, immediately raised an unsettling and genuinely fascinating question. Why would a society deliberately produce a child through such an extreme act of incest, and then bury that individual with such extraordinary reverence at the literal ceremonial heart of their most important monument? Researchers proposed an answer that sounds like something pulled directly from ancient mythology rather than a modern genetics paper, but which fits disturbingly well with practices documented in numerous other ancient civilizations around the world. Cass, Heidi and her colleagues suggested this individual may have belonged to a ruling dynasty that practiced first-degree incest deliberately, specifically because it was believed to concentrate and preserve a claimed divine or god-like status within a single bloodline, essentially treating this extreme act of inbreeding as a sacred practice reserved exclusively for a ruling elite who considered themselves fundamentally different from and superior to the rest of their community. This exact pattern, elite, sanctioned incest justified through claims of divine ancestry, is documented in numerous other early civilizations across the ancient world, from Egyptian pharaonic dynasties to Inca royalty to Hawaiian Ali'i nobility. Societies separated by thousands of miles and thousands of years, all independently arriving at strikingly similar beliefs that extreme royal inbreeding somehow preserved or concentrated sacred bloodlines. Finding the exact same disturbing pattern encoded inside a 5,000-year-old genome buried in rural Ireland suggests this deeply unsettling practice may be a far older and far more widespread feature of early human social organization than researchers had previously appreciated, and it fundamentally reshaped how archaeologists interpret the extraordinary monuments Neolithic Irish society left behind, no longer simply as impressive communal achievements, but potentially as physical evidence of a genuine, powerful, dynastic ruling class exercising the kind of absolute authority over their society that could command construction projects on a scale rivaling anything else in the Neolithic world. Now let's bring this story all the way forward to what modern genetic research reveals about Ireland today, because the picture that emerges is far more intricate than most people realize. Researchers working on a major initiative called the Irish DNA Atlas collected detailed genetic data from individuals across the island whose great-grandparents could all be traced back to the same specific geographic region, allowing scientists to construct an extraordinarily fine-grained genetic map of Ireland as it existed before the major population movements of the 19th and 20th centuries scattered people across the country and the wider world. What they found was that Ireland, despite its relatively small size, is not one single uniform genetic population at all, but rather splits into numerous distinct genetic clusters, each one tracing back to different regions of the island, clusters whose boundaries in some cases still echo old medieval kingdoms and territorial divisions that existed in Ireland well over 1,000 years ago, essentially a hidden genetic map of ancient Irish political geography, still faintly readable inside the DNA of people living in those same regions today, long after the kingdoms themselves have been forgotten by almost everyone except historians. And Ireland's genetic story does not end with the Bronze Age or the Neolithic either, because the same DNA carries clear fingerprints of later arrivals too. Norse Vikings began raiding and eventually settling parts of Ireland, beginning in the late 8th century, founding cities including Dublin, Waterford, and Limerick as Norse trading settlements, and genetic studies confirm measurable Scandinavian ancestry persisting in the modern Irish population, particularly concentrated in regions historically associated with these Viking-founded coastal cities, alongside later, more substantial genetic contributions from Anglo-Norman settlers beginning in the 12th century and English and Scottish planters arriving in significant numbers during the 17th century. Each of these later waves left its own genetic trace layered on top of that much deeper Bronze Age foundation, meaning the chromosome story connecting Ireland so strongly to the Basque country represents the oldest and deepest layer of Irish ancestry, not the entire story, but the ancient bedrock underneath everything that came afterward. So when you assemble every piece of this story together, what does the complete genetic history of Ireland actually reveal? It reveals an island that was first settled by Neolithic farmers carrying ancestry tracing. Back toward the Mediterranean and the Near East, farmers sophisticated enough to construct monuments like Newgrange with an astronomical precision that still functions perfectly over 5,000 years later, and apparently organized enough, or perhaps disturbingly enough, to practice a form of sacred royal incest eerily mirrored by ruling dynasties on completely separate continents. It reveals that this original farming population was then almost entirely displaced by a new wave of steppe-descended settlers arriving roughly 4,000 years ago, carrying the R1BY chromosome lineage that remains, to this day, the dominant paternal signature found anywhere in the country, a population whose arrival also seeded the genetic foundations for lactase persistence, blue eyes, and one of the highest concentrations of a serious hereditary disease found anywhere on the planet. And it reveals that this same population wave, sweeping outward from the steppes of Eastern Europe, reached not only Ireland, but also the Basque country, where geographic isolation and centuries of successful resistance against Roman, Germanic, and Moorish conquest allowed a strikingly similar genetic profile to survive largely undisturbed, creating, against every conceivable geographic and cultural expectation, the closest genetic match found anywhere in Europe to a windswept island sitting on the opposite edge of the entire continent. It is a genuinely strange thing to sit with, that two peoples separated by well over 1,000 miles of ocean, mountains, and completely unrelated languages, one speaking Gaelic and one speaking an ancient linguistic isolate, connected to nothing else on Earth, should turn out to share such a deep and specific genetic thread, written into their Y chromosomes nearly 4,000 years ago and never fully erased by everything that came afterward. It is a reminder that the boundaries we draw today, the flags, the borders, the national identities people feel so certain about, are almost impossibly recent compared to the actual genetic story unfolding underneath them. A story shaped instead by which populations happen to survive, which happen to remain isolated, and which ancient migration routes happen to end at that final wind-battered edge of Europe where the land simply runs out and the Atlantic begins. Every Irish person carrying that ancient R1B signature today is walking around with genetic proof of a 4,000-year-old journey stretching all the way back to the steppes north of the Black Sea, a journey that somehow, against every reasonable expectation, ended up writing nearly identical genetic history into two of the most stubbornly independent, culturally distinct corners of the entire European continent.